Fascinating session. Kieran Dwyer from CwC is going to be leading the panel on CwC and institutionalisation, opportunities and challenges. Over to you.
Fantastic. Good afternoon. And I'm going to put this cup here, and if you'd all like to contribute so I can get my £30 for dinner, and I promise I'll pay you later once I get to an ATM. Believe me. Good afternoon, and thank you very much. My name is Kieran Dwyer. I head up the communications team at CwC, based in New York. Before we go any further, I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves and where they're from.
Hi, I'm Daniel Bruce from Internews. I'm the Chief Executive in Europe.
Hi, Pierre Crémer. I'm Head of Communication at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Society. Sorry, it's a bit long.
Neha Kapil with the UNICEF Communication for Development team in New York, and I specifically look at issues of capacity development and institutionalization. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dylan Winder from DFID. I'm the Head of Humanitarian Policy and Partnerships, which includes all of our core funding to the UN, Red Cross and NGOs.
Thanks. Mark Bulpett, Head of Humanitarian and Resilience for World Vision UK.
Right, and the next part of the process is over to you. We're going to flip this panel just for a couple of minutes, and I'm just going to take a show of hands to speak for no more than 10 seconds, just to tell us what your expectations of this dialogue are, because it's a dialogue. The panel's just going to kick that off, so let us know, what would you like to see come out of this next hour? Just in case you were settling into a post-lunch stupor. I want to say, someone, you must have expectations. Yes, please. And if you might say your name.
My name is Smriti Patel. I work for Adesso Africa.
We'll do this pretty quickly, but...
Adesso Africa. My expectation is that to hear from the panel and perhaps some of the participants here, how can we move forward the whole agenda for localization? We've been talking a lot about it. What are some of the practical things that can be done to move that forward? Because
Right,
there's a
10
lot
seconds,
of
very good.
Thanks.
Thank you, we got that. Somebody else? Or we can randomly hand the microphone out and just demand that you tell us.
Rachel from the CDAC network. I'd like to hear what institutionalization means from a media development perspective.
Anybody else? Expectations for this next session? Over, gentlemen here. Yes, and then...
Hi, it's Richard from Save International. Save the Children International, that should have been. I'm just really interested in sort of what are the levers and enablers for institutional change.
I am Jacobo from the ICRC. I would like to leave the room today with 3 things I could start doing from tomorrow to do a better job at institutionalizing this within my own organization. And I would like Dylan, I'm sorry for putting you on the spot, what and how does DFID see things working or not working? How can we improve? How we can make a stronger case for this to be further supported? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take 2 or 3 more and then we'll get going. Please.
Mike Adams, First Response Radio. I'd like to see in Nepal, we failed to come up with a system to coordinate distribution of radios, to know how many we distributed, to know how many we needed. It was our big chance to get it right, and we failed again. How can we pull together as a network to coordinate distribution of items like this, non-food items?
Thank you.
Considering the combination of people in the front, I'd like to see if we really want to listen and use CwC engagement with communities, like how do we can draft our project designs that they're flexible and accountable towards our donors.
Thank you very much. And we'll take 1 more and then we'll get going.
Great, thank you. With the World Humanitarian Summit on the horizon, what are the concrete proposals that we should be taking to the WHS that can really drive substantial change on this, so that institutionalization is a reality rather than an aspiration? Thanks.
Great, thank you. So we hardly need a panel, which we already know because there is indeed so much knowledge and experience in the room. So the panelists are here to spark that discussion, I think, and not purely as the only experts, of course. So full respect to the experience in the room. I will just start by I'd like to come out, is how I generally like to start my processes. I began my international work rather accidentally, and as a grassroots activist and what might be thought of as a community mobiliser around self-determination issues in the 90s. And humanitarian in the pure sense is something that I've probably never been, but I've been in and around it for many years. And when I met Brendan, when I became onto the board of the CDAC network, I'd said to him, well, thank goodness somebody's created this network to move this issue forward, because if it hadn't been, I would have felt the need in the humanitarian system to try to do that. So I only say that because I come back to the opening remarks of Eve and of Nigel, which I think have really put the challenge to us. How do we make this part of the DNA of our organisations and of the future of humanitarian work? We are the converted here, but I myself have seen in the ways that I try to propose this to OCHA, a little bit too much woolly thinking among ourselves. I think this session, from my expectation, needs to both come from the right politics, but we need to be really hard-nosed about convincing our own organisations and building it in. And I think won't be enough to be coming from the right place. We're going to have to be smart and hard-nosed. So I'm looking forward to the panellists to be smart and hard-nosed, as well as coming from the right place. With that said, I think we might start from the opposite end. I'm going to scramble this panel so they have no idea when they're going to be talking. Panellists are only going to talk for 2 or 3 minutes, but there'll be lots of coming and toing and froing in the dialogue. So I can't even see the end of the table. Mark, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So just a few minutes on institutionalizing CwC within World Vision. I mean, CwC is a means to an end. I think Rachel sort of flagged that up at the beginning of the talk. It's about the end is about readdressing the power imbalance. It's got to be a whole of organizational approach. It includes technology, but it's beyond technology as well. So it's a whole of organizational approach. I mean, I think our high-end response provides some good examples for us, and I think it also such an enabling environment, and it enabled lots of different bits of the jigsaw to come together. And it's because all those bits of the jigsaw came together, that also really helped delivery. So a lot of that, of course, institutionalization has to happen before a crisis. So I think there's a few different areas that really tries to help drive CwC within the culture of the organization, within the systems, the processes, the attitudes, etc. You've got to have a clear framework to start with. You've got to know, the organization's got to know across the board what does that organization mean for CwC. It can't be overly complicated. It's got to be clear and brief. You've got to be able to understand it if you're for example, the sole needs assessor within a remote area, or whether you're tasked for setting up the whole system of accountability within response. It's got to have clarity. Ours is 4 sides long. The main part is 1 side. You've got to be able to translate it into different contexts and different levels. It's got to be usable and practical. And if you've got that, then you can identify competencies that you require to deliver that. And so that enables a capacity building approach. You've got to be able to have training, building your organization's capacity on that. And that's not just about technical experts in CwC, whether that's a technicians, or whether that's someone setting up the system, or whether it's someone on the front line behind a help desk. You've got to build up the capacity of that. That also includes, therefore, making sure you've got the right equipment up front. We heard from first response about radios, so getting the equipment where necessary, stockpiled before, ready to move, of course, is a good thing. We heard from Yves D'accord this morning about how you've got to have it, Well, he was saying that actually at senior level within the sector, CwC isn't known enough. For us, it was really important to get our senior leadership embracing and understanding CwC. So our Philippines National Director did that. He had gone on previous training about it and taken the initiative to bring in smartphones that we use for our basic rapid assessment tools prior to the typhoon. So he already was championing it. Institutionalizing it, you've also got to, for us, we make sure that we monitor staff performance against it. So, of course, if you have it within your scorecards or your performance mechanisms, and people are going to take note and want to do it, if they're going to be judged and assessed against it, it's got to be within those systems. It's got to be embedded within your response system. It's within our emergency management system, which means it's either in specific roles or it's at least within responsibilities of other individuals' roles. And that also therefore feeds into any surge capacity that you may require depending on the size of the disaster. You've got to, if you've got those individuals in the roster, then that, of course, enables a response on the ground. There's two challenges that I think it's fair to say we've had as World Vision on institutionalizing it. One of them is around, I think we haven't bridged the gap yet between our communicators and our humanitarian accountability staff. So our communicators are more outward facing towards the broadcasters and the traditional media. Obviously they're there telling the story, driving profile, fundraising, and awareness of the situation. But they are also the experts, of course, at telling stories, being able to communicate effectively and with a compelling way. So we haven't done enough work at being able to harness that skill set and give that, if you like, to the humanitarian accountability advisors who talk towards the communities. So that's something we can improve on. And I think also we always have a challenge in ensuring that CwC is everyone's responsibility. If you've got dedicated staff, such as World Vision does, that's really good if you're going to set up systems, etc. But there's a risk that others see that accountability in CwC is therefore their responsibility, where in reality it's part of everyone's, whether it's, for example, putting it into a program design or budgets, if you take that sort of one finite area. So you've got specific roles, but it's also everyone's responsibility at the same time, and managing that is a challenge. I've just finished. Early.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm going to ask Pierre, just because I was afraid at this end of the room he might not be paying attention.
I would say from a Red Cross, Red Crescent perspective, especially from the Federation, I mean, we don't have the issue of having communication to communities as part of our DNA. It's already there. Our issue has been much more, how do we organize it? How do we make it systematic? How do we document it? And I mean, how we mainstream as well, common standards, common approaches. I mean, for Ebola, for example, you know, this function was mainly handled by the volunteers. We had 10,000 volunteers working within the communities, coming from the communities, and doing the face-to-face campaigns and face-to-face job. I mean, that's the basic communication to communities, which means we are not only focusing on sending messages or whatever, it's very much on the dialogue. It's very much on the two-way communication approach. That will enable us to establish more systematic feedback mechanisms, and we had recent discussion around that. That will enable us as well to ensure that there is a level of satisfaction in regard to our programs, and I would say ultimately that will put us less as an implementing body than an enabler with the communities, which means that basically we should be in a position of co-designing programs and to be co-accountable to programs with the communities. Ultimately, that should be about that. So for us, community engagement or communication to communities is indeed a means to an end, but it's also a way of programming, a way of delivering outcomes and results, and ultimately, if we want to better integrate and to mainstream this approach and this function, it's also about showing the benefits of it. showing the cost benefit of what we call communication to communities, and to be able to, and there I think the donors have a responsibility somehow as well, to be sure that it's made absolutely systematic at any level of our programming and any level of our organization as well. For us, institutionalizing this function has been through a complicated process, because everybody was thinking they were doing that as a matter of business as usual, when actually it was not standardized, it was not really put into motion in a coordinated and coherent way. And what has happened there was we needed to do this kind of convincing job of having our governance, our senior management on board, our program managers on board, and to be sure that volunteers as well, because ultimately it's a bottom-up approach, our volunteers were fully on board. And then we have other issues in terms of how do we institutionalize it at country level, for example, how do we coordinate at country level, but I guess that's for another discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much. Nihar, I'm going to ask you to keep the conversation going.
Thanks. I think from a UNICEF perspective, one of the things to bring to the fore is that we have many different communication streams within the organization. And the area of work that I represent, which looks specifically at programming, so behavior and social change related communication, is slightly different from, you know, what the folks out there in external relations do, the guys in innovations do with the infrastructure. We have IT that supports us with supplies and things, you know, whenever there's an emergency. So, I mean, I guess this has been one of the starting points for us when we look at institutionalization. It's quite a mouthful. But the storyline, in a sense, is the same as what Mark and you, Pierre, have talked about. It's you know, having the capacity assessments done. Most importantly, scoping and defining very clearly what this kind of work actually contributes to the organization's work as a whole. So somebody mentioned outcomes at some point in this meeting earlier on, and I think the understanding and very clearly positioning the communicating with communities outcomes or the deliverables that you get from this work in the results hierarchies of organizations becomes important, because you get a clear positioning, and that has been the starting point for us then to define functional accountabilities, competency sets, job descriptions across the board in a large matrixed organization like UNICEF. The other thing that I wanted to add over and above what Mark and Pierre have highlighted is one of the things that we've been able to do is to leverage what we call a series of tipping points within the organization, events that have had relevance for communication for development. So Ebola outbreaks, for instance, in the past it was avian and pandemic influenza outbreaks, and leverage these events really to capture senior management interest for policy level changes that we want, or to make investments. And of course, then the major challenge for us in this case becomes, how do you take this very episodic and opportunistic interest and make it sustained constantly, so you have that stream of investment in this area of work, because it does get neglected, as many of you have highlighted in the past, and it doesn't get well integrated. It's usually an afterthought. You know, we don't have any system by way of which we have infrastructure and supplies out there. Just to add to, again, what Mark and Pierre have said over here, and I think we'll have a chance to add as we go along more information. Yeah.
Indeed. Thanks,
Stop
Neha.
here.
Thank you. So I'm taking some notes of things I will prod you all on later with our other participants. But if I could ask Daniel now.
Well, Kieran, you asked the question, what do we need to do to convince our organisations that CwC is important? And Rachel made the point about what is institutionalisation from a media development perspective. By virtue of the organisation that Internews is, and a number of the other media-related organisations in this room, we need less convincing because of what we do. And so our interest in the institutionalisation question is about the the enabling environment that is in the humanitarian architecture and the wider system that allows this work to happen effectively. That's not saying that we still can't do things better, because there's huge room for improvement. Our perspective, though, has always, in large parts of our programme work, been about creating programs, critically with local media organisations and other information networks that provide news you can use to communities affected by disasters and crises, and quite literally life-saving information. Now, 10 or so years ago, I think it's fair to say that there was quite literally an iron curtain between local media networks on the ground and a lot of the relief providers and the international NGOs and the overall humanitarian architecture. So huge progress has been made over the last decade, and I always think it's worth just taking stock of where we are today. The fact that we're all sitting here at scale in this room, in this venue, is testament to that. But we can't afford to rest on our laurels, and I think that's the key thing. And I think we're almost seeing right now some next generation problems for CwC and some of the goals and aspirations of the CDAC movement. So the title of the panel is, what are the challenges and the opportunities for institutionalization? So just a handful of points on both of those questions, if I may. I still think we're far from a perfect model, and I know that this question around, is there a kind of standard design that we can apply to how we do CwC as a system as a whole, is one which is very much alive and kicking as part of this conversation and some of the thoughts being fed into the World Humanitarian Summit. But I'm not actually sure that there is a perfect model. I'm not sure that it exists, because the way that we provide communication, the way that audiences, that individuals consume their information varies so wildly from one context to another, and also according to the type of disaster or emergency that is being dealt with. We've seen major steps forward, of course, but for every success, we often hear of significant failures or gaps in response. Even in Nepal, where we've consistently heard today that there have been huge steps forward in this work. Mike's highlighted already a point on the distribution of radios, still getting stuck in the system, and that's a really important point. And for all of the collaboration and the sector-wide efforts, we've had anecdotal evidence of numerous media organisations in Nepal who've basically been trying to make humanitarian information programming, but when they pick up the phone to some of the agencies on the ground, they're just getting nowhere. And these are often media organisations in some of the most remote areas. But a couple of really sticky points I want to touch on now, and I'm sure we'll come back to these through the course of the panel. I just think we need to be careful with some of our terminology and our acronyms, because we have a great thirst for acronyms in this sector of ours, do we not? Let's not muddy CwC too much with AAP, for example. It is part of the jigsaw, but it is certainly not all of it. Just 12 months ago, there were people who were contending that they are the same thing. It is our contention that they're really not. Accountability is part of CwC, but CwC is not a tool to tick the accountability box with. Neither is CwC in isolation about social mobilization. Neither is it about behavior change communication. These are all things which go into the pot, but it's much bigger, it's more nuanced, and it's a very complex jigsaw, and I think it would be remiss of us to neglect that point. And I'm afraid, from our experience, even again in the last 12 months or so, we're still seeing a tendency of the system to default to the instrumentalization of media in crises, using the local media as a means to an end to getting key messages out, but not engaging with them or in a substantive way to build their capacity to do this work autonomously, but also to provide them with opportunities to interact at scale and meaningfully with the humanitarian system. I will give you one very pointed example. In the Ebola crisis in Liberia, there was an Ebola media working group that was set up by the system. The Ebola media working group in Liberia did not include any representatives of the Liberian media. We really can do better than that. And the response that was given when this was challenged was, oh, it's too complicated, we haven't got time, they don't understand. So if we really want to do the localization thing, and if we really want to drive change, we've really got to get over some of these default tendencies that we're seeing still today, despite the progress that has been made. The system has got to be more open, transparent, and it's got to be open to criticism and challenge. And I think this is the other stickiest point that we're facing. When it's all going tickety-boo and the messages are being broadcast and all of the agencies are getting stuff out and the communities are absorbing it and they're providing useful feedback, that's fine. But when things go wrong, the shutters tend to come down. A brief example from the Philippines. I'm not going to name the organization because it's not necessary, and I'm going to keep the example vague. But a service was being provided after Typhoon Haiyan. That service ran into some significant problems because the facilities of that service provision were basically heavily compromised because of the complex environment in which we were working. This was a large-scale problem. This was flagged by some of the local media networks on the ground, and the organization involved basically said, no, we can't talk about that. We don't want that broadcast on the local media. But that's accountability. When it's going wrong, you have to be able to provide a response. And again, these are recent examples. So there's still a considerable way to go. The system has got to have that readiness to take on challenge and be less self-referential. Opportunities, very briefly, because I know you're going to ting your glass in about 30 seconds' time. 10 years ago, we were dealing with a very abstract concept. I think one of the biggest opportunities, and huge kudos to the CDAC network, to BBC Media Action, frankly to our own organisation and others who've produced big bodies of research and starting to build the evidence base around how this CwC does make aid more effective and transparent and accountable. I think there's a baseline there to build on, but I think we've got to continue to invest in the evidence base. I think that's really important. The existence of forums like this provide greater credibility to the movement. It would be nice to see a few more CEOs and senior people here, I have to say, because I think that's one of those levers of change, is getting the senior people in the big international organizations involved. And we also, finally, really need to use some of the successes and the positive things that we've seen in disaster response and leverage that into recovery more substantially, because I think that's another area which is probably being somewhat overlooked compared to a lot of the investment in immediate response.
Daniel, thank you. Lots of provocation there for all of you to pick up on in about 3 minutes. But before we get to that, I'd like to ask Dylan to wrap up this last part of the first part.
Great, thanks. I'm not sure I'll wrap it up, but let me first of all also come out, as it were, in the fact that I think it's the mid-90s, I was working as a livelihoods advisor on rural radio, listening groups for farmers and agricultural extension, and the very first market information price detail coming through on mobile phones. So it's great to be sitting here now, but the point, I guess, is that there's also a lot going on in the development sphere, and we need to make sure that we're making those links. So in terms of incentives, the first thing I wanted to talk about was incentives globally, because I think this is a massively important time for this group of people. We are at significant stretch on the system. We've got stretch and both in terms of finances, but also in terms of staffing. We've got increased complexity of disasters. We've got places we can't get into physically, and we've got a World Humanitarian Summit coming up. So I do think that now is a time to really demonstrate how the CwC area fits with these broader things, and I think it can make a really big, important difference. So I do slightly disagree with Daniel in terms of the CwC and accountability to affected populations, because I think that's where the international system is, and we probably don't need to be quite as protective of our boundaries, but see the opportunities from some of these kind of key things. So in terms of DFID, what do we see as the incentives for this? First of all, I think it's around a renewed focus on affected people driving responses, understanding needs, looking at how we better target through that understanding, which links into a word you'll probably hate, but the kind of whole value for money efficiency piece, which I think this agenda is also really important for, given that we're so stretched internationally in terms of resources. I think also we are quite focused on obviously the different types of disasters, and conflict, protracted crisis, really key, and also preparing better. So I think there's a kind of whole piece around how can we better prepare. And there were some good examples today of doing things in advance, but not enough on the conflict piece, I think. So, for example, DFID, 75% of our humanitarian budget goes into protracted crises. The natural disasters are quite small in terms of the actual scale. So if we can really do something differently using this agenda in those areas, I think that's going to be really critical. In terms of the kind of things that we've been doing, I mean, there's several things that DFID can do. First of all, you know, we funded InfoSaid, which was a sort of precursor to CDAC, so we can use our money to start to kind of bring together ideas and people. We can have funding guidelines. So, you know, within our rapid onset, we require organisations to look at communication. We have specific communications organisations, many of you here, as part of our rapid response facility. And we also have developed two new big business cases for £240 million a year, which is one is the Red Cross movement, and one is the UN. They're collective. So we're no longer saying to the UN, we will just have individual arrangements with you. What we're doing is providing indicators which help the system come together collectively. And quite a significant focus of some of those transformative agenda initiatives are around beneficiary feedback, accountability to affected populations. So we can do that sort of thing within our criteria, a little bit of a stick, as it were, on trying to make sure that organisations are focusing on some of these issues. I think also, you know, it's really important that we have the capacity in this area, and I don't think DFID probably has enough people who are understanding communications enough, but at the same time, I think there's a bigger issue globally. I think actually we need more people who are experts who, as I think Nigel said this morning, are able to support humanitarian country teams, who are able to sit alongside resident coordinators and really sort of be the technical eyes on this. And we need to do more to bring people, particularly from the south, into that sort of pool of people. I think there are some really good examples, and this is where the sort of, you know, the stuff we've again seen today, the Nepals, the sort of Iraq, where we can share that information, we can demonstrate the bigger impact. And I think this is a point that Pierre made on making sure that we're able to, that the results from your work contribute to the much broader policy agenda. So really being able to demonstrate that connection. And finally, I think, you know, we can all fund these things, but actually there's a problem. We often find it difficult to do communicating with disaster-affected communities because we don't have the proposals in. You know, you don't necessarily put in good proposals all the time. So I think we need to get much better at the organisations who are multi-mandate but have some of these expertise, but also the kind of media outlets to put in proposals to donors to make sure that your projects are part of the strategic response plans, to really kind of provide that sort of support, and we can then fund that. And then finally, I think, you know, sustainability of this network is really critical. So I was very pleased to hear my colleague from Luxembourg today talk about wanting to join the network. Well, we're sort of part of the network because we put some money there, so we can have a discussion later about the funding that you're now going to put into CDAC. But I do think that that's really important, and I also think the opportunities that we've got these days around social media, innovation, working more with the private sector, you know, it's fantastic. So it's great to be here, and I think this is a really exciting moment for the network, and I hope that you can really think about how the things that you do and are expert in can really contribute to the sort of broader agenda, and let's seize the moment of the summit to really make a difference on these issues. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dylan. So as exactly we had planned, we've got really quite different perspectives here because we have people coming from very different experiences. But in the room, there's even more in terms of perspectives. So I'll hand it to the floor in just a minute if the mics could be ready. I do think that there's, I would also just like to say that the World Humanitarian Summit, which OCHA, of course, is playing a key role in coordinating, is a massive opportunity for us as a network and also for our area of work, more significantly even than the network as such. So I think it's critical both that we position this well, and I think it's critical that we identify the moments in the process when we can have the most leverage. And certainly from someone inside OCHA, I'll be very happy to work with all of you on that. And I can see some areas of potential controversy. CwC, accountability, that's certainly an area that a couple of people raised in the panel. It's an area that internally I know is talked about a lot. As we define how to institutionalise this, with total top commitment within OCHA as a top priority is communicating with affected communities. Operationalising it, you sometimes get into that discussion. So I'd like to see that unpacked a little bit along the way. And then I would also like to see, as we answer questions here, a few more practical examples of things that haven't worked and maybe things that have worked. And a sense of where do we need to be in this work in 5 years from now? I'm just going to throw those challenges up. They're not specific questions, but you've got your marching orders from some expectations in the audience. You can hold their feet to the fire now, anyone. So not really audience, just the larger panel. Over to you.
On this point of AAP, just to, I don't disagree with you, Dylan. Not that I'm trying to make the panelists suddenly more boring, but my point is that I think there's a risk that CwC gets wholly put in the AAP box. It's a very significant share of it, but I think that we've just seen a little bit of slippage into forgetting the other things around the edges. And I think when you over-professionalize an area of CwC, then it starts to become a little bit more like strategic communications as well. And I think that's something that we've got to be very, very careful about as well.
I won't consider I've done my job properly unless we have provocation and maybe a fight amongst the panelists. So. So I see a hand way down the back. Let's start right down the back. And if I could ask you to, even though many of us are friends and colleagues, we don't know each other totally, so your name and where you're from, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Astrid de Vallon. I am the coordinator of the Interagency Standing Committee Task Team on Accountability to Affected Population and PSCA. I don't want to enter the debate on CwC and AAP. I think if we are all there together is also to ensure that we have a meaningful engagement with community, whatever we call it. So I think that's what our aim should be. My question to the panel would be, what do you see as the main challenges and opportunities to actually complement the institutionalization at individual level, at individual agency level, and to move it to the collective level? So we've heard already some voice about that, but we have had some examples, for instance, of the Iraq call center, the Nepalese project, but there are still exceptions to the rules. So it would be interesting to have your point of view on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Why don't we take 3 questions and then we can divide them up among the panelists, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Louise. I work for the ICRC, formerly used to work a lot with the Red Cross in terms of community engagement, as it's now called. So in this former life, when we would go through the process of trying to institutionalize community engagement, oftentimes I'd get to the point with the National Society or the institution where they'd say, yeah, great, we're on board. But what are we on board for? Can you just give us a definition of what is the success? What does it look like? And how do we know that we're actually reaching this goal that we're trying to achieve? Especially, there's a lot of debate around here in terms of CwC, AAP, community engagement. All of them seem to have little different identities. And so I think people get a little bit confused around what we're actually subscribing to. So be very happy to profit from your collective wisdom. Thanks.
Thank you. And I can see another hand here. And then we'll answer these 3 and come back again.
It was just hi, my name's Katie. I work for Save the Children UK. It was a piece around the opportunities, and we've highlighted the World Humanitarian Summit, but I just wondered whether there was an opportunity in the core humanitarian standard and some of the movement behind that, because a lot of the rhetoric in the standard is around placing communities at the heart of a response. And a lot of the discussions are how do we actually institutionalize that standard, so maybe there's some synergies that we could pull on, and I just wondered what the panel thought about that.
Okay, now I think I won't make it so hard as to the panel to say you have to answer the question, but you need to respond to the question. And I'm going to look for hands on the panel. I'm not going to carve those up. Who'd like to respond, pick any question and respond to it? If we start, well, let's start with the start. How do we move from individual agency to a more systematic way of responding collectively? Who'd like to take a piece of that? Yeah, Neha from you.
Maybe in part, I would respond to that. I think one of the things to recognize in this very sort of chaotic space, because there's many different types of emergencies. If you're looking at conflicts or natural disasters and public health emergencies, there's a sort of differences in approaches that you bring in and the kind of actors that come in. And for us, at least in UNICEF, for the communication team, we've encountered this challenge in terms of bringing the competent staff and expertise in. From a communication dimension. So recognizing that, one of the things that we've been trying to do, especially post-Ebola, which impacted a lot of us very deeply, is working with our colleagues in OCHA and with the CDAC network in putting together a sort of what we are calling right now an options paper, but really an interagency coordination mechanism. And my colleague Alexandra's here, Rachel's also been commenting on it, and I think that it's going to be opened up to everyone if it isn't already. We've received some comments from the CDAC network, right, Rachel? So the idea is how can we rapidly come together and organize ourselves at the, whenever we have an emergency. And of course, different actors within our groups would get called upon to take lead roles, depending on the kind of mandates we have and the niche that we have in this area of work. So it's still in nascent stages, but really the idea is that this group of people who are putting together this sort of framework wants to take this forward, and we are going to be starting the discussions soon. Yeah, so I'll stop here.
Good. I'm going to ask, I think I've got Mark and Dylan both. I'm going to ask you to join some issues here, if you might, if it's within your bandwidth. We've talked about partnership this morning. We've talked about needing much more of the South in this network, in this approach to the work. So when we talk about institutionalizing this work, what is it we're trying to institutionalize? What kind of, is it just our own organization institutionalization, or are we reinventing a different notion of what that might mean if we join up this panel's focus with some of our broader discussions? You can still answer, Mark, even if that's not what you want to answer.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to go back to that original, that previous question around how we can take individual organization, institutionalization of individual organization to more collective. And certainly from an NGO sphere, I'm sure others can talk more informatively about sort of common platforms, etc., which of course NGOs are part of. But within the NGO world, I can think of it's around where we come together. Often it's around funding mechanisms, or where we collectively come around together because being together is stronger. What I'm thinking of, so DEC, UK's Disaster Emergencies Committee, has an accountability framework. So we are all bound and wish to show how we are accountable to our communities, but of course it's also to the UK public as well. So there's different elements of that, but certainly we have to wish to and define ourselves as the collective, how we are accountable to our communities. Similarly, sort of the START Fund, in that area, we ask, so that's 24 international NGOs. We ask within that reporting mechanism and proposals, how are we accountable to communities? And then, of course, the collective with DFID and the Disaster Emergency Preparedness Programme, that focuses on capacity building, and CDAC has the £3 million grant within that. So that really looks at how we can build the capacity across multiple agencies within CwC. So there's some examples there of how we do come together, either because we wish to be together as a collective whole and therefore work together, or where funding mechanisms enable that.
Great, thanks. I was going to answer the same question. I'm glad you mentioned the START Network, because I was also going to mention the START Network as a really good place where people are coming together, and the whole emphasis is around local decision-making, local capacity building, and I think that's the way we should be looking at that. But I wanted to sort of, just in terms of how can we get a more collective rather than individual thinking on this. I think part of it is evidence. So you're generating a lot of evidence already. So we need to make sure that that evidence is getting to the right people who are setting the broader country-level strategies. And I think that there are good ways of doing that, and there are bad ways of doing that. And you are obviously your communicators, so you can come up with the good ways of doing that. I think also this is about doing things in advance. So, for example, fantastic example in Iraq of the telephone helpline, but I understand that took 6 months to get to the point where it could run because of agency bureaucracy. So actually, members of CDAC need to work through some of these issues in advance of responding so that you can work together quickly in a response. So I do think there's a bit of a bureaucracy issue when it comes to working together more collectively. I think also we need to sort of step back and look at, again, the sort of sticks. So if you look at the UK, for example, we have a gender bill, which means it's a legal requirement for every project that we fund to have something which says something on gender. It doesn't mean you have to do gender, but you have to have considered it. I think the SRPs or project cycle management should have something in there which says you must consider what you're doing on communicating with communities or AAP or however we want to frame it. So there are some sticks, and it's great that Otcha's in the room because you kind of oversee some of those sort of guidelines. And I think the other thing which is really important for all of us and increasingly important for us as a government agency, we're spending British taxpayers' money. It's about transparency. We have an independent commission on aid impact, which is basically our watchdog. They do two things. They make sure that we spent the money well, and they go and see the beneficiaries who've received the money and make sure that they got what they needed. And that's been really powerful. So I think shining the light back to us on some of these things is really important.
I'm conscious that we've got two further questions we haven't yet answered. What is, as Louise said, how do we define success in this area of work? What does it look like? And also, perhaps you touched on that a little bit around the core humanitarian standards. What other opportunities do we have in addition to the WHS? So anyone want to respond to those 2 points before we move on? I am conscious, I'm worried about my friend Jacobo, who will not leave this room happy unless he's got 3 things he can do tomorrow. So I also want you to keep that in mind.
Jacobo's always got 3 things to do tomorrow and many more besides, from my experience. I think part of the success question is actually some of the things which Dylan and Mark have mentioned, which is actually having frameworks in place that to an extent, for want of a better word, force some of this to happen in the first place, but measure it, because as we say in the SDG debate, what gets measured gets done, so that will have a huge impact. But just with my internews hat on again here, I think ultimate success comes back to this point of knowing that it's okay not to have total trust between local media organisations, who are by and large the vehicles needed for CwC and the system. And once we've got our heads around that and knowing that there are pain points along the way, then I think success will start to happen. But all of the time we're trying to sort of find convoluted ways around protecting ourselves or our organisations and our messages from the independence of local media, then I think we're going to get stuck. And sorry to bang on about this point, but it is, I think, one of the biggest sticking points that we're seeing at the point of implementation at the moment. So I'm not going to say a trusting relationship with the local media, because I think there's always going to be inherent distrust, but a more accepting and collaborative relationship, I think, is a key part of success, but obviously not the whole answer.
Anybody else like to chip into this? Pierre.
Yeah, maybe a quick point, and it will go to the localization of aid agenda as well, which I believe is quite key. I mean, we had a success in 2010, for example, in Haiti. And one of the reasons for that, it's not only because we injected resources there and in a sizable way, but at the same time we were able to build on local knowledge. I mean, if we are not empowering this local knowledge, nothing can happen, let's say. And we won't speak about communication to communities if there is no communities, and if we are not building on the local knowledge to make it happen. So I believe the localization of aid is the way forward, clearly. And the capacity to make this community stronger, almost in a model like do it yourself. Like would say my colleague from the American Red Cross, that will be very difficult to move forward our humanitarian agenda. I mean, we are in a sort of paradigm shift there, which is, I repeat myself, which is we are providing services, indeed, but basically the work is done by the communities themselves. We are more an enabling actor than an implementing actor. And I believe that it takes some capacities indeed to develop a network of practitioners, a network of service providers, but mostly the goal is really to build this local capacity. That's the way forward, I believe.
Thank you. We'll take another round of questions, and I might add that, or ideas from the floor, and I might add that if someone from the floor has a great answer to a question from the floor or a great example, give it. Don't feel that this is only where it's a table to the floor. It can be floor to the floor. Nigel, I see you at the back, and then here at the front, Peter, and then.
So, yeah, I'm still wondering whether we're remaining within our comfort zones and carrying on from what Pierre just said. Just let's go back to the issue of what is success. Is it better engagement so that our existing approaches can be more responsive? Or is it better engagement so that others can do what we're doing today? And if so, then what do we do in the future? Is it greater efficiency in our service delivery and responsiveness, or increasingly local-owned response? And if so, then are we comfortable with that, or does it create some discomfort that maybe there's some irrelevance in the future? What does institutionalization look like if it requires better preparedness and collaboration between humanitarians and development folks? So you're having that discussion in the agencies. What does institutionalization mean if in 5 or 10 years what we're doing today is much less needed, if at all? So it seems to me, I'm not sure that we're really facing this. Is it because the big UN agencies and the big NGOs feel they're too big to fail? So is there a discomfort area that we're not discussing? And if so, what is your discomfort zone about transformation? Thank you.
Great question. Let's take the other ones. That was kind of what I was trying to get to in my point about institutionalization, but you say it so much better. Peter.
Picking up on something that was said earlier today when Nigel talked about...
Could you just introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. Peter Lunding from the World Humanitarian Summit Secretariat. Picking up on something that was said earlier today, there was a lot of talk about decentralization, and that was the way forward. Now, with regard to communication with communities, obviously, if you decentralize all the way down in the community, you've kind of solved the problem. But if you are on the national level, do you see any challenges or problems related to communication with communities, or obstacles or challenges? Just a question.
Thank you. And gentleman at the front. And then we'll take some responses. And that might be the end of our time, but we'll see.
Hi, Andy Wheatley, DFID. As one of the people who often receives CwC proposals and documentation coming from NGOs, I'm not sure it's a plea or a comment or an observation, but perhaps it's a combination of all three. There's always the so what question. What does this add? What will change as a result? How can you demonstrate that something will be better, the programming will be better at the end of this process by undertaking these series of actions? And I'm quite soft touch with these things, but I think a lot of my colleagues are far harder targets than I am. So the question, I suppose, or challenge to the room is when thinking through some of these issues, how can it be as action-orientated as possible? What will be done? What concretely will be in place? And what's going to be better as a result of that?
Great, thank you. Back to the panel, and I'm going to let you pick your question, but I'm going to look for anyone to respond voluntarily to any of these, keeping in mind Nigel's big question, almost the elephant in the room. Volunteers, Dylan?
Thanks. Well, of course, I'm going to agree with Andy. But no, I think on Nigel's big question, I think this does hit the spot. Ultimately, we should all be doing ourselves out of a job, except for the really, really big crises where we can't respond ourselves. But I do think there's an issue about global flows of funds. How can we get more funding as a donor to southern-based organisations. I think the NGO global model at the moment probably needs to change a little bit, although, you are becoming more localised. You do have, I don't know, Oxfam, Kenya, for example. So, how does the civil society model evolve? And I think that's a really important question. And then I do think you will need some UN agencies in terms of kind of normative functions. And I think, for example, setting standards around how you do communicating with communities might be a useful organisation. And after all, the UN is the member states. So the member states include most of the countries we work in as well. But I do think that, some of the sort of delivery mechanisms could potentially be done by local civil society or local government, or they could be done by the private sector. So that kind of thing may well change. But I think, we need to have these big challenges with us as we are thinking through our programming. And I think, again, coming back to the point about limited resources, limited capacity, if we don't change how we do things, and if we don't think about this localization, we're not going to have enough resources to be able to respond to the current levels of need. So it's really critical that we do this.
Volunteers, please.
Give another shout out to the DEP programme as well, which I think is obviously quite new, but it's on the cusp of doing some really important work, which touches on both Nigel's point and also this point of challenges at a local level. On the CDAC bit of it, developing these working groups in Bangladesh and South Sudan to create a local civil society infrastructure which is more able to do response and CwC on its own, I think is absolutely critical. There is an operational reality, which is that in some of the programs that we've done through the Rapid Response Facility, is that because we're working with local media infrastructure, which has either been heavily damaged by a natural disaster or which is institutionally weak inherently because of where it is in its development cycle, you often end up having to do the emergency response work and the capacity strengthening on the hoof at the same time. And that's immensely difficult and really, frankly, it's not desirable best practice. And so I think the DEP program is really moving the conversation towards doing the preemptive capacity strengthening and resilience, so that you start to have the kind of civil resilience structures in place at a national level, which we have in this part of the world with our own host governments and national broadcasters and so on and so forth. The models exist. It's just about getting the preemptive capacity there in place, which in turn allows the localization and the nationalization of this kind of work.
Thank you. Other responses? Yes, Mark.
I guess just a thought on Andy's point. It's not a solution, I don't think. I think it's a reflection. I mean, I think I'll give you an example and then make the point. So for our Philippines response, our shelter work, we established criteria, work with focal points within the communities as to which are the vulnerable parts of that community, people of the community. Came up with a list of who should get the supplies, and then we sort of put it out to consultation, if you like, to the broader community, so they could feedback by text, etc. And that changed about 20 to 50% of households changed within that original list, based on a broader consultation from the community, based on the criteria. So I think, so that was an example. But the point, I think, is, rather than a solution, is I think it's hard to measure success because you're going to have to see what could have been worse. So I think that's the challenge. It's like the resilience debate, isn't it? How you measure success and resilience. I think we need to do it. I think we need to look at how we can evidence it. But I think we have to grapple with that challenge as how we measure what could have been. Yeah.
Neha, are you putting in a bid? I'm just trying to...
Actually, I wanted to, the question on how we're linking up with development and humanitarian work, and specifically for executive agencies like UNICEF, and I can only speak on UNICEF's behalf here. I think the question becomes very much from a normative point of view, what kind of standards we want to work with for system strengthening, and especially again for agencies like UNICEF that work across sectors. You know, we're working with the health sector, we end up working with justice systems, with water sanitation, ministries, for example, that work on water sanitation. The question is, what kind of standards are we putting in place? What kind of policies are we enabling around how these programs themselves get created and implemented within countries, and also fostering those links then between civil society organizations and the government. So for us, it becomes a question of looking at system strengthening. This is something that we've been engaged in post-Ebola, for instance, on the health systems. And herein for us then becomes a discomfort area, is how would you start measuring then what becomes successful in these long-term change processes. So if you're looking at policy change, you're looking at community engagement to become integrated and institutionalized in national programs, and also creating a healthy relationship between civil society and the government. What become your measures of success, and how do you hold yourself accountable in this process? And I think that's one of the struggles we really have as being a part of the UN system, and it's certainly something that I've come across in my experience, is putting these indicators really down and defining for ourselves where we're going with this from an institutionalization perspective. So.
Thank you. I think we're kind of at time in terms of questions, because I'm getting the signal. To wrap up, first of all, this afternoon after the coffee break, there's a World Humanitarian Summit session. And I think that session needs to come up with, obviously, some clear ideas about how to maximise that opportunity. And I think, just to say, the summit in many respects is a kicking off point for a future agenda. It's not going to be a closing point when deals are done. So the network, and I think all of us as organisations need to be looking at it in that way and looking at a long engagement here. And I think this, Nigel, plugs into your large questions, is that what you said earlier this morning in terms of this group of people, this network, in a sense, we're at the forefront of something that we have been at the forefront of new thinking in humanitarian response in a way that now puts us right in the middle of a tectonic shift. And that tectonic shift relies on people in our organisations, in local communities, local organisations, that are going to be working through this over time. So we need to place ourselves well through that summit process, not just to end in May next year, but to bounce forward. So we need to position ourselves right and get that right. So I really encourage the best, take all your best brain power to that meeting this afternoon. I think we've had other really interesting ideas through this session and the day around leadership. What we need to do, perhaps as, in inverted commas, the experts, better evidence bases, better internal advocacy, better joined up efforts together to what has worked in our organisations to bring the clarity of thinking that is needed. I think that there are, in all of our organisations, probably very senior people that want this to work, and they want to be shown how it can work and what it will result in. So I think that we're knocking on an open door, but that's what I mean about being hard-nosed. So we talked about evidence bases. We talked about other opportunities along the way. The humanitarian program cycle, which OCHA helps prepare, that is a strategic area where we've zeroed in on to say this will help make it easier for everybody if we identify at each step of a humanitarian planning and response where this work comes in. And so obviously we're working with the network and partners to figure out how to best define that, to then enable donors, actors, to join up on this. So there's the completely large transformative ideas, and then there are steps along the way. We've only touched, I'm afraid, on the knowledge in the room, but I think that it will be important for the network and for individual partners to look at evidence bases together, to share successes, to unpick failures, and to build along the way in the normative cycles and processes. And I think the network can play a role in helping us share our good experiences together. So we change the tyres on the car as we're driving, and maybe we start flying as well in the future instead of driving. Or maybe we just can go home and play golf. While someone else does all the work instead of us in the future. So on that note, I want to thank all of the panelists, a really rich diversity of perspective and approach, and all of you other panelists who've been sitting not on the table, but at the other panel. So thank you very much.